So Black Tech Futures Research Institute was founded in 2020. It's housed at Stillman College. And the goal of this organization is to help do research to inform stakeholders, organizations, community leaders on how we can improve the outcomes for African Americans. Also, as part of this work, given the learning, giving our placement in this country, in the United States, the learnings that we have here are applicable to any vulnerable group. And this is the big win for us all. So let's consider 3 examples of particular use cases where we might need some sort of visibility on the data, the experiences of Black Americans and other vulnerable groups. So let's just say that there's a Black student that lives in the South. She may live in a rural or urban center, and she was raised in a home where there were food insecurities. And it may be due to rising costs, it may be due to the lack of stable jobs, all those things kind of come into play. We also noticed that in some places, depending on if it's rural or urban, there may be inconsistent internet access. And therefore, that means that the computer literacy lags behind the access because you don't have the time to practice, you don't have time, the availability, or you cannot afford the internet access to access the resources that are readily available online. Right. She attends a school that offers AP computer science courses, but there turns out to be no highly qualified teachers to teach that course sufficiently. Given her lack of internet access, she may not be able to access the online resources. So therefore, that means it makes it significantly harder for her to pass the exams, and therefore makes it significantly harder for her to for that student to pursue other enrichment programs and skills. This includes enrolling in programs such as code.org, other relating programs, or code academies where you have to do a portion of your work at home outside of the school. Okay. Well, then if this particular the area in which she lived, if they had consistent internet access, that it was affordable, that it was high quality in a way that is equitable to all the other populations in that city, then that particular student would have a greater opportunity to access all of the resources and the opportunities that are put forth online or that requires hybrid experience, meaning both in person and online. The second scenario that kind of highlights this problem is that, hey, there's a brick and mortar restaurant, a Black-owned restaurant, and they've been seeing that they've seen a drop in revenue. People aren't coming into the door. Okay. Without some sort of equity in this technology field or technology realm, then it makes it significantly harder for those Black business owners to get access and the know-how to put their businesses online, meaning put them in Postmates, put it in Uber Eats, and all these other online systems. It also makes it significantly harder for this group to come up with a point of sale systems or implement point of sale systems that make their checkout and their ordering system more efficient even inside the business. So again, it's another example of a disparity that causes groups to kind of lag behind again. And the third scenario is that to say that there's a Black developer. They are working in a company and just so happens they have to leave that tech company because of unwelcoming work environment. We know that work environments are a challenge to make equitable and safe for everyone. Okay. So because of those microaggressions they may experience, they may have to resign or they may choose, and then they therefore decide to keep pursuing that career, but in a path on their own. They may choose to be an entrepreneur. But because of disparities in both the tech field and other places that consume and build upon the tech field, meaning other industries, meaning access to capital, it makes it significantly hard for this entrepreneur to take their idea and scale it, or take the idea even to market to test. Okay, so if we address these type of disparities with these 3 cases, then we teach ourselves how to address these issues across any other vulnerable groups that are having similar disparities in technology. Okay. So what I'd like to do is start with the Bronfenbrenner's ecological model of development. Okay, and so we start. I know, of course, when he created this system, it was around childhood development. That's why we see the child in the bottom of this graph, and we can see there are these concentric circles that represent the systems that this child is interacting with directly and indirectly. For example, Okay, the microsystem are the individuals or the adults this child or person are interacting with directly, their parents, their friends, the adult, so that they know they aren't their family members. Okay, the mesiosystems relate to the interactions between adults that are influence the child's life or a person's life. For example, the parent-teacher relationships is an example of what happens in the mesosystem. And we know that this system from micro all the way to macro goes to, like I said, interpersonal relationships, but also goes all the way up into policy and institutional level changes and laws that eventually affect the child's life either directly or indirectly. Of course, we know that Bronfenbrenner later on added on the chronal system to provide that chronological element, a time dimension, because we know that some things that are changing in society have a temporal effect. We know things like trauma or things like laws may be things that are that have a time dimension impact on our lives. It's not just a point in time, it impacts us. Okay. So how we experience oppression. So yes, Bronfenbrenner and all the sociologists use this model in a way. But when it comes to our everyday lives, we really kind of look at the graph on the right. We think of our community. We think of the interpersonal relationships. We use the organizations that we interact with on the day-to-day and how those organizations are functioning do impact our lives. Like if we go to the grocery store, but the grocery store is dysfunctional, then that impacts our ability to buy food and eat, our ability to survive. So in the everyday, we are looking like the graph on the right. Still these concentric circles, but this is definitely centered to any individual, not specific to children. Any group where we can label falls into this realm because we're all experiencing this world, this shared human experience. And so there's all these different little levels in which there may be opportunities where oppression to seep in, definitely at the social political level and at community levels. Yeah. So one of the things that came from some of our research is looking at, are there other kind of frameworks out there that think of the entire human experience to involve both the human experience or the human interaction portion, as well as the humans inside of the environment or as part of the environment. So I began looking at the European Commission Maze report from 2016. This is where this graphic comes from, where in their report, they're looking at how do you develop restorative practices for the ecosystems that humans depend on for survival. Okay. In that same kind of light, the thing that we highlighted in our work was that these social economic systems that drive human well-being may need changing to push changes in the ecosystems that we have in nature. Also, those ecosystems impact us in some way as well, right? So this is more than just like humans interacting with forests and trees and the outside. We can also consider these ecosystems to be things like waterways, things that drive our drinking water, the air that's around us that we can breathe. Is it clear? Is it clean enough? Things like that. That impacts our human well-being. Okay. And so we sought to figure out a way to try to sort of kind of improve this sort of cycle here, where we can make some tangible changes inside of the socio-economic systems by modeling some of the things we know that work well inside of nature. We know that nature functions very well when it comes to biodiversity. So that means that we probably should take that into account when trying to build a society that has a decent amount of biodiversity when it comes to humans. We need to be able to all coexist. Okay. So this is something that that we came up with, that the Black tech ecosystem is an ecology of technology and non-tech Black tech institutions, organizations, and issues within a city. Okay. And this is made up of individuals, organizations, communities that make up the tech landscape for any geography. This is created by the Black Tech Mecca report back in 2000, I think it was 2016. Okay. And so we using that model to give us a better understanding of how do we assess and take inventory of the things that we already have that may be in response to an existing system that is oppressive to various groups. Okay. So in order to do that, we leverage what is called the Black Tech Ecosystem Index. And the Black Tech Ecosystem Index is a collection of metrics across across a few indicators and metrics across these things we call subsystems that represents parts of the human experience. So if you are a person who has a family and decided to move, there are various questions you have to ask yourself in order to ascertain if that right new geography or that new location is a good place to live, or what adjustments you need to make in your life to adapt to the new place you're moving. You have to ask yourself about the schools. If you have little kids, you got to ask about the schools in that area. If you're needing to work in that city, you need to figure out like how it is. How can I get a job? Is it fair? Is there enough jobs? You have to figure out how do the governments work? What are the interfaces that you have with government, and all those government agencies are efficient enough in the ways that help you achieve your personal goals and your familial goals. Okay. And then what we've done is added on something that when we talk about later, which is the Black critical digital infrastructure. So we took all these indicators, we collected data, asked all the questions, we took a lot of quantitative data, and we did this, and we combined it in such a way so we're able to get some sort of understanding on where Black America is in various cities in terms of its response to the impression that it historically have received. So again, here we go back with this concentric circle. We have the individual, interpersonal, organizational, all the way up to social political. And I think any of us can pick out any of these circles and find maybe something that we've learned recently that may be a reflection of oppression within one of these concentric circles. So the human response to oppression, period, is the building of assets through all levels of the human experience that we just happen to call subsystems. That's the K through 12 subsystem, that is the workforce subsystem, that's the government subsystem, all those pieces. And so to build those assets means to build semi-permanent or permanent structures, build entities as in like businesses and organizations, for certain people to attain roles in various organizations, to develop certain interpersonal relationships. And all these things are what any oppressed group does to survive in an environment that is trying to hurt them. Okay. Then that is what we all do. So the thing that we found when we were looking at these cities, we found that just like any other oppressed group, we've already created infrastructure. And just so happens the infrastructure that leads to the group being able to make inroads on bringing about equity in their own real world is broken down through K through 12 STEM organizations. We have Black Tech Pipeline organizations, which are organizations that help with the fueling of resources for individuals and organizations that are trying to make change in their communities. We see, as just like in history in the civil rights movement, Black multi-faith institutions have also a big role in the infrastructure that we have and depend on as communities. We have Black entrepreneur organizations, which are training the next future, the future business owners, and making sure they have the ability to bring their ideas to the market. As well as we have our HBCUs that they're allowing us to have some level of equity when it comes to us being able to contribute positively to the academic arena. So this sort of like these set of assets, or this sort of infrastructure here, is some of the things in which Black America has built so that it could survive in the face of oppression. It's one of the greatest comeback stories we've seen in human history. So as we were collecting data, because we're collecting the data about something that is very sensitive and something that doesn't have units, right? We can't talk about oppression in newtons or joules or any of those SI units, but somehow we need to recognize the issues that people have already experienced, but also give us a way or inroads to how do we address the problem in a way that takes into account everybody's experience, the progress that has happened since slavery, and also give us hope to continue, right? So one guiding principle that I instituted with this project was Black assets is greater than oppression. We're going to use that mathematical statement in any of our work that we're talking about going forward. Again, The assets are the specific pieces of infrastructure that has been built to respond to oppression, to help us survive. Okay. So I think everyone can agree that oppression is negative. Okay. So what we've done is that when you're thinking about these Black assets or any assets, these assets are distributed across any of the subsystems. Right. So that means that there are going to be times where we're collecting information about the infrastructure itself, the critical Black digital infrastructure itself, and then also there will be times in which some of the assets are present in the other pre-existing subsystems, systems that we may not have created on our own. Okay? And then that gives us a more accurate accounting of kind of what are the things that we have or don't have that contribute to other parts of the human experience that not only that Black America interacts with, but the rest of society interacts with. So again, the guiding principle was Black access are greater than oppression. So what we did was like, well, clearly systematic issues contribute negatively to our lives. I think we can kind of go there. I think we got it. So what we've done is assign those levels of those subsystems to negative numbers. And then we counted whether or not the Black asset existed or not. So regardless of how you look at it, Black assets are greater than oppression. Okay. And this model, this way of looking at it, allowed us to see beyond simply the repetitive kind of like the repetitive fact that, hey, people are oppressed, right? Usually we hit that we are oppressed and people stop. People get tired of talking about it. People get tired of hearing about it. But in this way, we begin to sort of still recognize the facts there that oppression does exist and impacts all different types of groups, including the intersectionalities of these different groups, but then also recognizing the beauty and the tactics that they've developed to respond, the safe spaces that they've created. So we can able to give it proper respect and to say that we now have a way to funnel in whatever help we can provide to make sure that we're building infrastructure in a way that is equitable to multiple groups, everybody. So this is the scale we did. It was fun. So again, we took those numbers, negative numbers and positive numbers and zero, and we asked various different metrics under these indicators. There was like 300 and something of it. There was a lot of things, a lot of questions we asked, and we did it across multiple cities. And so what that problem does, it allows us to create, it's basically a multi-value function way. It allows us to create dual scores, okay? It allowed us to be able to say, I can see if I look at only the oppression, if I put in my blinders on and only look at the negative, then I can see kind of where it is relative to 100, which is usually an A. And then I can also look at the same kind of system and look at the positive and say, oh, well, if we focus on the positive, we know that there is some wins. And we know that the reality that we experience, as any vulnerable group does, you have this dual reality or dual truth that you must always consider. You must consider the world that you're interacting with that may be hurtful. And you have to consider the assets that your community has built so that you can survive. Both of those things are true. And our true experience is usually the combination of those two. And this is an example of Memphis scores. Well, 14 out of 100 sounds pretty bad, when it comes to oppressive systems, right? It's not 100, it's definitely 14s, very low F, right? But we know we can't stop there. We know we have to also recognize some of the things that were built either by Black Americans or also the society. Even the change in society over time helps the development of some infrastructure for vulnerable communities. And our experience is the combination of those. And that's the reason why we took this approach. So the numbers here, regardless if it's out of 100, I know we like grading scales. We should not be too discouraged simply because the number is low. It's really the goal of here is to provide a context to the infrastructure that already exists in these cities where the oppression already exists. What is the thing that people are pushing back on? Pretty powerful. So we did this collection of what we call Dreaming of a Black Tech Future. And we covered 4 cities. We were Birmingham, Alabama, Nashville, Tennessee, Memphis, Houston. And this cover here that you see on the right is an example of a cover of one of the reports. Okay. And so we went through every city. We identified the critical Black infrastructure organizations. We paired it with the huge index, the Black Tech, the Black Tech Ecosystem Index, and put it all together to create those scores. Then in addition to that, we also provided actionable recommendations for the states and the cities that we did the assessments for. So not only do you know kind of where things are in terms of the oppression, and you already kind of see what the things people have built in response to that oppression, but now you can say, well, if you want to truly build an equitable future, this is where specifically you can invest to build that equitable future. We're talking about specific zip codes. We're talking about specific census tracts. We're talking about opportunity zones. We're talking about organizations in proximity to those zip codes, opportunity zones, census tracts within and surrounding. So that allows us to actually have a definition of done, that we have a goal, we have an actual heading, a North Star, is to invest in those infrastructures that vulnerable communities have built for themselves, right? We can't solve all the problems, but if we can all come together and make sure that we're investing in that infrastructure, then we're empowering people to build those solutions for themselves, because they're already doing it. Okay, so the thing that we learned from all this is that vulnerable doesn't mean helpless. And we needed all the math to do it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have half an hour for Q&As, and for online participants, feel free to either raise your hand or type your question in the chat. Any question from Kishana?
I have questions. Yeah. Can you hear me? Hi. Thank you for the presentation. I wonder, what might this look like in a rural area? You know, because I'm really fascinated with the critical Black digital infrastructure. Where are some of the stakeholders and places to start, and kinds of questions, or who I should ask to start to develop these capacities in rural areas? Do you have any kind of go-tos or some best practices in places like that to start?
Oh yes. So there's usually community-driven organizations that are trying to address those sort of problems. And so definitely your local chambers have members from those community organizations trying to address those problems. Some of the questions you may want to get asked is how well are the citizens in that area are leveraging existing infrastructure and resources. For example, libraries is a real good kind of thing to look at. Are they using the libraries? What programs are at those libraries? Where do those libraries serve? We know that libraries have their geography, but usually people travel still if they need those resources. So asking about those types of programs in the libraries give you a good indication of what problems they already exist. And it also tells you what questions to ask and say, what organizations are trying to address those problems, and to kind of go from there.
Any other questions? Let's check. Sorry, do you have a question?
I've got tons. I'm really fascinated. If it's okay.
Yeah, go for it. Let's do it.
Hi, Kishana again. How are you all measuring oppression? How have you defined it? You know, what kinds of indicators are you using to say, hey, this is we can measure oppression in this kind of way? Can you help me understand that part?
Yeah, absolutely. So showing my screen, it should be the index again. And so so we have inside of each one of these indicators, we're asking questions on various type of like on these indicators based on these metrics. Like for example, workplace culture. We asking like, well, is there even a there's usually like some sort of like employee-centered group in various locations that for vulnerable communities. Like the Black Googlers are a good example, some sort of protected space that these groups have sort of created, and all those organizations headquartered in those areas. So if we know if a company is in that area, then more than likely the people who are of that group that you care about is going to probably partake in that employee-centered group. Another good example is let's say K through 12, where we're talking about the qualified teachers. Okay, so sometimes when even though you of course you need to be certified to be a teacher, but doesn't necessarily mean that a certified teacher can teach every single subject. And so if you're having gaps in the skill sets of the teachers in the geographical area, then you're less likely to kind of have in students being able to take those subjects, being AP subjects and things like that. A good example also is the distribution of those qualified teachers. Are they over all the schools? Is AP computer science everywhere in every single school? Or do the state have a way where students can kind of remotely join an AP course that is at another school? All those types of questions that we ask. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
And I'm really intrigued by that framing that you said of Black assets are greater than the oppression. Like, is that like, kind of like a mantra or like an ethos that drives you, or are you literally like saying that the assets that are present and exist can maybe outweigh then the harms of the oppression that may have been like factored through that ecosystem?
Well, it's definitely the second, because one is I love math. I love math. So if I ever have an opportunity to throw in math, is great. And so, but this is a reflection of things we already know, right? This is not a new concept. We know that things that are positive to us are better than oppression because oppression is negative. I think we can go with that as a fact. And so therefore, this relationship here is just us saying, given that we know this in the inside of our heart of hearts, how do we put this in a form that gives us information from the data that we've collected so that then we can do stuff about it? And so, yes, this was the guiding principle so that we can go beyond just the rehashing of the negativity, but also to give us hope as a collective to say that there are positive things that we can feed into that help address the problem as well.
Thank you. There's a question from online participant, Jen, asking, is this ecosystem index directly translatable to other vulnerable groups? For instance, Indigenous peoples in Canada?
Yes. So one of the things that we hope is that you can take our own experiences and wild learnings from our experiences and apply it to any group. What we're saying is that the same in every group has to build infrastructure in response to the oppression, including genocide. If people have been killing you off, right, you're going to have to do something to respond. It's a survival response. And it's that group trying to its best to be resilient against the historic and the current pressures. So yes, it's directly translatable. Every vulnerable group has created safe spaces and infrastructure for themselves at every level of the human experience, including the digital experience. This technique can play everywhere.
Thanks. Well, I do have a question. Oh, sorry, please. Oh, Dana.
Thanks so much. I have a question about the numbers, since I know you're a numbers person. If you could go back to that slide you were just on, am I reading this right, that for critical Black digital infrastructure in this model, it's kind of either a 5 or a 0? Or is it like, it could be, 1 or 3 or anything like that?
No, this is 5 or 0. Either it is present or it is absent. And so here's another example that's similar, right? The places where you see on this graphic where it's absent is kind of yellow oranges. And so, there are things that we know that probably will be positive for certain vulnerable groups, but they may not have it. Like if they don't have if they don't have representatives in their local government, it'll be an asset for them to have it. And them not have it is not necessarily strictly oppression. They could also just not have it at that time, right? But you have to take another set of like measures and collect more data to determine if that's a reflection of oppression or simply just current, people voting. You know what I'm saying? Like there's so many things that go into that. And so, yeah, we want to make sure that we're not penalizing these groups because they haven't developed an asset, because there's so many impedances to get that asset there. Here.
So then I'll continue with my own question is, I'm curious if we can expand a little bit on the statistic you used to compute the index, and whether you encountered instances where the indexes the statistics you were looking at and the factors you were analyzing also like included into themselves the systems of oppression. So for instance, they didn't track certain things, or the classification systems used to measure something like included or disregarded systematically some aspects that were essential for oppressed groups.
Yeah, we did it in two ways. One is we took into account missing data. That -4 represents missing data. So would we go through any of the open data sources that cities and states and federal governments have? We look at any data sources that we can get on our own from various organizations. That there's a lot of this stuff some of this is out there. But when you have a specific question and the data is not dimensionalized in a way that makes it useful for you, or the the governments have an open data portal where they don't include race in one of the variables, sometimes they can be like, well, I can't even use this. And so sometimes they were just missing data because of the impression they want to give or whatever political things that are out there. So definitely that's one. And then second is we did normalize across any of the indicators. We normalized across the subsystems. And then we also took into account that we also made it possible where these Black digital critical infrastructure kind of indicators and their metrics do fall under some of these subsystems. So we had to kind of count it in a couple of different places, and this had to make sure that our algorithm kind of just works. Because for example, when we're talking about the Black public technologist groups, then we're also talking about tech entrepreneurship. We're talking about workforce that has impact on there. And so we know that because we are making sure that Black assets are always graded in impression, there's not one negative indicator that can or how many say it the other way, there's not one asset that can completely eliminate some other indicator some other negative indicator we found. It doesn't vanish in that way. And then also is that we know that the infrastructure doesn't stand on its own, right? It's not sitting on an island without interacting with society. There's pressures on that infrastructure, even though it's being built. So for example, it's saying like, oh, hey, we want to, we have multi-faith institutions as an infrastructure, but at the same time, we know that there's shootings at the multi-faith institutions and there's attacks on there, right? And that is an oppressive environment for the infrastructure that may be positive. So placing it and finding home for these digital infrastructure metrics and indicators inside of where they are in the human experience is reflective of reality. We know that those things exist in our society, and that helps us be able to kind of figure out or kind of like see the interactions between the system that already exists that may be oppressive and where our infrastructure lies and how those numbers interact.
So there's another question from a participant, Joanne. Love the quantitative methodology and inclusion of Black assets in this conversation. Thank you for offering this approach. In your survey, of 4 US cities, have you identified a leading Black asset shared among these cities that is deeply lacking? Is there any single indicator that, if increased, would shift the equation of Black asset greater than oppression the most?
No. When we did our assessment, there's no one indicator that can tip the scales that much. And the reason why is simply just the size of the existing society is so large. The interface, if you think of it like a computer screen and an interface, it's so many buttons, so many knobs, and you at the same time don't exactly know how they all work, and you also don't have access to all the knobs and the buttons. And so because of its size, no, there's no one critical Black infrastructure organization or indicator that could just topple it and solve the problem. And the goal isn't exactly to find that either. It's really to say that we know that the society is kind of a big thing, and to topple it would say that the few can really do that. But I don't think this, oppressed groups kind of lack power. That's kind of their thing. They have power, but they lack some sorts of power, some forms of power. And so we know that because of just the massiveness of these subsystems, we would really have to grow the infrastructure so large where it's exactly congruent or close to being congruent with the rest of these systems. And that's a good way to that's a nice something to hope for, maybe, right? If we could say that the infrastructure that every vulnerable group was roughly the same size and dimensions of all these subsystems, then yeah, it would definitely be like we're all good. You're getting A's everywhere in every city. But that's not reflective reality. So we're not really on that part of the graph at all. What we're recognizing that because these are so small, they may be small and mighty, but we don't have the dimensionality that is reflected here in the subsystems all packed into the infrastructure here. We haven't been able to get that yet. So maybe in the future, if they ever exist, then I guess we'll revisit.
Can I ask a follow-up to that question? Okay,
Yes.
let's imaginative space. Let's say of this whole chart here, you could only take 3 things with you. House is on fire, we got to run out. You're taking 3 things, and that's going to be the only thing that you can apply in any space. What are the 3 things that you're going to take with you?
That's a good one. I would definitely take the multi-faith institutions. They're undefeated. They're pretty undefeated. I would take access to financial capital. I would take the digital equity at the municipal level.
Okay. Why those 3?
Well, things happening at the local level impact us usually the most on a day-to-day. Multi-faith institutions have historically, and today, made a lot of impact when it comes to, or basically cornerstone in a lot of the change that we have had and desire. So a huge network. So it seems pretty good. I think I also said the access to financial capital, because that's kind of what a lot of the vulnerable groups need. In this society where, in the U.S. is definitely capitalist society. And sometimes in order to make grounds, the one thing that you kind of need is capital. That's the one thing a lot of groups are missing, that they have all of the work, they have all the know-how, they have all the time, they're doing their best in every other dimension. And then somehow they're just unable to get that. So if we can get that, then that would definitely help out a lot of things across all sorts of verticals, meaning both infrastructure, but also K through 12. We're also post-secondary. We're talking about people being able to, get better jobs, people that start their own companies, like all those things. So yes, those 3.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. I don't know where we are for time. I'm really interested in this. What would you say to folks who might see this model and see your work and think that it is in service to capitalism, that we are creating a Black capitalist class? Is that something that you would agree with, or do you think it's more nuanced than that?
Well, In terms of people's impression about the work, I hope they see it as something that can be applied in other domains. So that's what I hope they take from it. Whether or not it is a capitalist is trying to create a black capitalist class, I think it's really about how do we survive in this class, right? I think we have aspirations to see if we can hopefully change systems. But the fact of the matter is that change takes a long time. It takes a certain amount of power. It takes a certain amount of resources. And so given that we don't have that on hand, and given that if we can ask, we might not get it, it makes much more sense to say, how do we work within the existing systems to make inroads where the capitalist features may not be persistent through all parts of the human experience. We do have to be there, right? We still want to go to the grocery store. You're still paying the taxes. You still contribute to some private entities, pockets, because you want to go to the grocery store. But also, what if the food was better? So those types of kind of it is a little bit more nuanced. Is where there's multiple dimensions or sides, I guess I want to say here, when it comes to the things that we interact with in society. We're interacting with both a capitalist kind of like money-driven component that also have non-monetary components and impacts on our lives that are just as important. So we got to be, hopefully it teaches how we can survive in this existing system until it changes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Jay, please.
Yeah, I was like, I know everyone sees my hand. I love this, by the way, and I've been taking in just like a lot. A lot of my work, I look at like critical like technology, just like practices specifically for the Black communities. And one thing that I think like, as far as like working in tech and thinking about innovation and how they can take up space or how Black communities take up space within technology innovation. One thing that I often talk about and think about is like the culture of innovation. And how people are impacted through that. Like I am like a multi-generational like Mississippian. My family were formerly enslaved people, then sharecroppers, and my great grandmother talks about like how when like the cotton gin was introduced and how this was like a revolutionary like innovation for agriculture in the South, but for people who were sharecroppers that were already like picking cotton had to work harder, had to work longer. Labor was much more intensive. And so when we think about like encouraging, innovation within our communities, I think there's really, deep differences in the way that innovation and capital has historically been able to support wealth acquisition in the US versus what we're able to do, I think, in today's times. And one thing I'm always trying to push, even like some of my family members to think about is having not basically attributing this model of, I don't know, like historical like whiteness and power to what we perceive as happiness. And so all this to maybe ask, when we think around like innovation and pushing for innovation, like how might we envision more like equitable and innovative futures for communities that have basically don't have the advantage of exploiting human capital to get these things done, honestly.
Yeah, there's so much. I'm gonna go back to this slide because this matters. But one thing I want to push on is that when I think about this work and when I do the work on the day-to-day is less about technology and technology adopting to drive wealth acquisition. I think that's something that people kind of push a lot. You hear that drum all the time. Jump into tech and you get a great paying job, right? All this they've been saying that for a decade now, right? Multiple decades. But I think what we also know is that tech adoption is what you're talking about falls, as you say, it falls on the S curve, right? We know there's an inflection point at some point, inflection point in the middle. But what tech does, in addition to wealth acquisition for some, it also changes human behavior on a collective scale. And so if we're able to change kind of like social economic systems or build the technology, and when I'm using the broad definition of technology, when I'm saying that, is how do we adopt technology in a way that changes our collective behavior in a way that is less oppressive for most people, And so I think we've seen it kind of not specifically making it less oppressive, but we've seen definitely technology making a collective impact in ways we might not measure, which is social media is a good example. Like, yeah, technically there are people who are working really hard. Some people are being oppressed to create the batteries and to get the old technology and deal with the waste of the technology. That is exactly happening. And then also there are those who have not had access to wealth or have not had access to community. They're able to use those very same technologies to get that wealth, to get that community. And we've seen that with the social media movement. So I think there's both happening. And I hope that in my heart of hearts that we cannot fixate on the focus on wealth. I know it's very easy to, because money is very close to us all. But really see, like, what are the other impacts we can drive with adoption of technology, including changing our behaviors on the individual level, on a communal level, and then on the societal level.
Thank you for that.
Hi, so I have a question. First of all, thank you for a really fascinating presentation and the work you're doing. And I just wanted to pick up on the last thing you said, because in many ways, the idea that this is beyond wealth, right? And that I see your work very much in conversation with someone like Andre Brock, for instance, who's talking about Black joy, but in a very different way, as well as King Gallen's work, who's looking at data for Black lives, right? So I see you sort of in conversation and in that field. I also see, like, the ways that often this work gets done in terms of figuring out assets versus detriments in interesting ways is someone like Ira Katz-Nelson's work, where he shows how affirmative action in the past has been white, and that if you document all the infrastructures and benefits, you see exactly how much whites, especially in America, have benefited from all the social programs that have been in place, everything that's there, right? So to what extent do you see your work in conversation with something like that? But also, I think that when you said that this is more about wealth, when it's framed in terms of Black assets, I think there's a way in which people might perceive it as only about wealth. So are there other terms or other ways of framing to get to some of what you're pointing out? Because a lot of communities as well have pointed out, we're here, like the myth that indigenous folk are gone. It's a myth, and that there's all sorts of ways to think through assets or land or relationality and what gets valued.
Well, so the first kind of question, I'm gonna go back to this number here, this example here. So this was designed to not compare infrastructure between different subgroups of humans. This was designed to see the context of infrastructure created within the existing oppressive system within a specific geography. That is the only point of its comparison. Everything else is kind of like, you can come up with all kinds of conclusions. But this is the focus. And in terms of the interpretation of wealth is more than just money. Wealth can be community. Wealth can be health. We say that a lot. It rhymes. And so I challenge everyone else to rethink wealth. I say, well, maybe there's other forms of wealth we can have. Let me give you another example. Let's go back 2 pictures. Let me go to this one, okay? So for example, just say I'm a Black entrepreneur. And we know that if you're starting a business, you need relationships, right? And so some people can get relationships with people who have a lot of money, right? And they get a lot of money about their idea, or they get a lot of money to show when they show that they have product market fit, whatever, okay? Well, not everyone can get access to that. What is it, less than 2% of all of the VC funding go to Black women? And it's been that way for a very long time. So we know that not everyone's going to get access to the money to build a business. So if you still have an idea and you still feel like it's important, and even if you validated that it has product market fit, you still need the resources to scale. And this is where this little graphic on the right comes in. So because you're already in a system that's not equitably giving you access to funding, which is an indicator under our tech entrepreneurship subsystem, then you have to find another way. everybody's gonna be like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? It was the love thing that people love to say, right? Well, then you got to find a way, you got to find some straps, you got to make some boots and find some straps and some soles. And so you're going to have to build some sort of relationships that are interpersonal, that are organizational, and sometimes even community driven, so that you can get the resources to help your ideal go. We may need to barter. That's a different way. Now, that's a different form of wealth. If I have access to the people that can not necessarily give me money, but can give me the thing that I need to deliver an output in some kind of way. So yeah, I challenge everyone to rethink wealth in that way, not be so centered on the dollar.
All right, so we have time for one last question, 5 more minutes. Adrienne.
Yeah, I have a few questions. I wonder how you have thought about, you know, I feel like I hear this a lot lately about we need to center Black people more, and we need to make sure that technology is focusing on them. It scares me a little bit to hear that when I don't also hear like how we plan on getting the bias out of the systems before we center them in the systems. So for example, I used to be a junior high teacher at a tech-owned charter school. And I can say for sure that all that tech in those schools is not safe for kids. It's not healthy for kids, and they're actually not learning as much. I know the way they do it in my district is like the schools with the most technology, the public schools, the community has kind of said are the ghetto schools. And the more wealthy and more affluent people get, the less technology they actually have in their children's schools. So I'm all for building the assets, but I worry about how we can say the assets are bigger than oppression when our assets are still owned by rich white men on the back end.
Well, I think those are some good points. Let me start with the first kind of like bullet point you kind of pointed out, is like, because the existence of technology in the space doesn't translate to usage that's beneficial to a vulnerable group, right? It sounds like what you're saying. And that's true. I think that's the difference between access to technology and literacy. And so making the technology available doesn't solve the problem. But one of the things that we have, a couple of the indicators that we have in our index, is speaking directly to literacy. How is that group able to then use that access in a way that's beneficial directly to them? In terms of getting the biases out the system, well, consider this model again, it's on the right, is that if we have the literacy, then that means that with more literacy, then more people, vulnerable groups, can then build the things they need to change the bias in the technology, right? So if we're talking about algorithms, if we're talking about newer technologies or existing technology or improving upon them, then if we have the literacy, then you more than likely are able to build. And so when I say literacy, I don't just mean consumer. I know that the United States is a capitalist system. We are driven by consumerism. But in addition to consumerism, we can also build. And so this is about with the assets that Black people has built, not bought, built. And so whoever owns it on the piece of paper, that is an important detail, but it doesn't have to be the detail that or the value that we get from it. The value that we get from it may be orthogonal to the value that an oppressive system may deem from it. The land value might not mean anything to actually doing something on that land.